On a rain-soaked stretch of Highway 23, an extraordinary reunion is about to unfold. When Thomas Mitchell stops his old pickup truck for a stranded traveler, he thinks he's just helping another soul caught in the storm. He couldn't be more mistaken. The woman he's about to give a ride to is Margaret Chancellor, one of America's most enigmatic billionaires, a titan of industry who vanished from the public eye years ago. But that's not the most shocking part. 47 years earlier, on this very road, she was the young woman who stole his heart, the love he let slip away. What Thomas doesn't know is that this isn't a chance encounter. Margaret has spent months orchestrating this moment, and the next few hours will change both their lives forever. This isn't just a story about lost love. It's about how destiny sometimes takes half a century to deliver its most precious gifts. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Thomas Mitchell's morning routine hadn't changed in the 3 years since Mary's passing. Each day began with the same ritual: coffee brewing in the decades-old percolator, 2 cups set out from habit before he'd catch himself and put one back. The kitchen window of his farmhouse faced east, and he'd watch the sunrise paint the sky in colors that reminded him of Mary's watercolors, still hanging in neat rows along the hallway walls. This particular morning had started no differently. He'd pulled his worn leather wallet from the dresser, running his thumb across the faded photograph tucked inside, a young couple at the Clayton County Fair, 1975. He rarely looked at the other side of that photo sleeve anymore. Some memories were better left undisturbed. The forecast had predicted rain, but Thomas had errands to run regardless. The local hardware store needed his expertise. Retirement hadn't stopped the steady stream of folks seeking his advice on everything from broken tractors to temperamental furnaces. 45 years of running Mitchell's Auto and Repair had made him something of a legend in Clayton County, even if his son David now managed the day-to-day operations. As he drove his old Ford pickup down familiar roads, the radio crackled with warnings of an approaching storm system. Thomas adjusted his reading glasses, squinting at dark clouds gathering on the horizon. The weathered Highway 23 sign passed on his left, and for a moment his mind wandered to another rainy day, decades ago, when that same road had led to a different life entirely. Mary had understood about that road, about the girl he'd left behind. In their 38 years of marriage, she'd never once made him feel guilty for carrying that small weight in his heart. "Love multiplies, it doesn't divide," she'd told him once. Her wisdom as practical as everything else about her. Even in her final days, as cancer slowly dimmed her light, she'd made him promise not to shut himself away in grief. "Life's too precious to waste on regret, old man," she'd said, her hand cool against his cheek. "When the time comes, you open your heart again. Promise me," he'd promised, though he'd never imagined how that promise might be tested. The first heavy drops hit his windshield as he passed Miller's Creek. The morning's errands could wait. Something about the gathering storm tugged at his conscience. He'd seen too many stranded motorists on days like this not to worry. The bed of his truck still carried tools and emergency supplies. Old habits died hard. Up ahead, through the strengthening rain, a figure emerged by the roadside. Something about their posture spoke of wealth. Even in distress, there was an elegance to their bearing that seemed out of place on this rural highway. Thomas slowed his truck, wipers beating a steady rhythm against the strengthening downpour. As he pulled onto the shoulder, his headlights illuminated a woman in a grey business suit, her silver hair elegant despite the rain. She turned toward his truck, and Thomas felt the world tilt slightly on its axis. Something about her face, barely visible through the rain-streaked window, tugged at a memory he'd buried so deep he'd almost convinced himself it no longer existed. His hands trembled slightly as he reached for the passenger door handle. At 72, Thomas had thought himself past the age of surprises. He was about to discover how wrong he was. "Need a ride into town?" Thomas's voice emerged steadier than he felt, the practiced casualness of a man used to helping strangers. The woman hesitated just long enough for another sheet of rain to drench her further, before nodding and reaching for the door. "That's very kind of you," she said, and something in her voice made Thomas's heart skip a beat. She wore a simple brass key on a chain around her neck, its antique design catching his eye as she settled into the passenger seat. The key seemed at odds with her clearly expensive suit, and the subtle gleam of what he suspected was a Cartier watch at her wrist. "Storm caught you by surprise?" he asked, easing the truck back onto the slick road. The woman, he guessed she was around his age, though she wore it with a grace that spoke of careful maintenance, smiled slightly as she brushed water from her sleeve. "Not exactly," she replied, her voice carrying a hint of something Thomas couldn't quite place. "Amusement? Anticipation? I've learned that sometimes the best moments come from being exactly where you need to be, weather regardless." Thomas found himself stealing glances at her profile as he drove. There was something maddeningly familiar about the way she held herself, the particular tilt of her head as she gazed out at the rain-swept landscape. His hands tightened on the steering wheel as an old memory tried to surface. "You seem familiar with these roads," she observed, her fingers absently touching the brass key at her throat. Thomas noticed she wore no rings, though there was a band of skin on her finger that suggested one had rested there not too long ago. "Born and raised in Clayton County," he replied. "Ran the auto shop in town for most of my life. Mitchell's. Maybe you've heard of it?" He wasn't sure why, he added. "That last part. Visitors rarely needed more than basic directions." She turned toward him then, and Thomas caught the full force of her grey eyes. "Mitchell's," she repeated softly. "I might have heard of it, yes. Thomas Mitchell, isn't it?" The way she said. His name sent a jolt through him. In his mind, a door he'd kept firmly shut for decades creaked open just a fraction. "I don't believe I mentioned my first name," he said carefully. "Didn't you?" Her smile held secrets, and that brass key glinted again as she shifted in her seat. "Must be famous in these parts." The rain drummed harder on the roof of the truck, and Thomas felt as though he was driving through more than just a storm. Each mile marker they passed seemed to pull him deeper into a maze of half-remembered moments and might-have-beens. "Where exactly are you headed?" he asked, realizing he hadn't gotten this basic information yet. The question seemed to amuse her. "Forward," she answered simply. Then, perhaps taking pity on his confused expression, she added, "The Rainbow Diner, if it still exists. I find myself craving their apple pie." Thomas nearly drove off the road. The Rainbow Diner had closed 15 years ago, but more importantly, their apple pie had been locally famous in the 70s. He'd spent countless evenings there with the key around her neck. He knew that key. He'd watched a young woman, with chestnut hair not yet turned silver, lock away her dreams in a hope chest with that very key before heading off to college, promising to return. She never had. "Margaret," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the rain and the sudden thundering of his heart. But she was looking out the window again, her expression unreadable in the reflection. "The diner's gone, isn't it?" she asked, though something in her tone suggested she already knew the answer. "So much changes in 47 years. The number wasn't random." Thomas felt the years collapse between them like a stack of cards, each memory sharper than the last. But before he could respond, a flash of lightning illuminated the road ahead, revealing a fallen tree branch blocking their path. "Looks like we'll have to wait out the storm," Margaret said. And this time, there was no mistaking the careful orchestration. In her voice, she'd known exactly what she was doing, standing in the rain on Highway 23. The question was, why now, after all these years? Thomas guided the truck onto a small turnoff, killing the engine but leaving the radio on low. Through the static, an old melody struggled to be heard. Fleetwood Mac's Landslide, the same song that had played at the Rainbow Diner the night Margaret had told him about her college acceptance letter. "Still keep the old radio," he said, more to fill the silence than anything else. His hands remained on the wheel, though they'd stopped moving. They don't make them like this anymore. No, Margaret agreed softly. They certainly don't. She was watching him now, her earlier pretense of unfamiliarity shed like an old coat. You haven't changed as much as I thought you would, Thomas. He laughed, a short, uncertain sound. Now that's either a kind lie or your eyesight's failing. I'm not exactly that 18-year-old boy anymore. The eyes might be a little more weathered, she said, but they still crinkle the same way when you're nervous. You always did have a tell. The rain continued its steady drumming, creating a cocoon of sound around them. In the distance, thunder rolled across the hills, like a memory trying to surface. Why now, Margaret? The question came out before he could stop it. After all these years, she touched the brass key again, a gesture he now recognized as habitual. Did you know they're tearing down the old library next month? The one where we used to study. Supposedly study anyway. A smile touched her lips. I saw it in the local paper. Sometimes the universe hands you deadlines you didn't know you were waiting for. Thomas remembered those study sessions. The way Margaret's hair would fall forward when she bent over her books, how she'd tuck it back with ink-stained fingers. The library had been their refuge, the one place her wealthy parents never thought to look for her. You disappeared, he said, quietly. After that summer, not even a letter. I wrote hundreds of letters, she replied, her voice carrying an edge of old pain. Each one explaining why I couldn't come back, why I had to prove myself first. Each one a little more cowardly than the last. They're still in a box in my study, yellowed and unsent. The radio crackled, the song changing to something more modern that neither of them recognized. Thomas reached out and turned it off, leaving them with just the rain and their shared history. I saw your name in the papers. Sometimes, he admitted. Chancellor Enterprises, the tech boom, the acquisitions. You built an empire. I built walls, she corrected him. Very expensive, very impressive walls. Did you know I had a corner office on the 82nd floor? You could see half of Manhattan, but on clear days I found myself looking west, wondering about a certain auto shop in Clayton County. A particularly bright flash of lightning illuminated her face, and for a moment Thomas saw both versions of her simultaneously, the ambitious young woman who'd stolen his heart and the accomplished one who'd found her way back to him. Mary used to read about you, he said softly. She'd cut out articles, leave them on my workbench sometimes. She had a way of understanding things I never said. Margaret's expression softened. Tell me about her? She was... Thomas paused, searching for words that could bridge past and present. She was like sunrise, steady, beautiful, inevitable, made everything she touched better just by being there. I saw the obituary, Margaret said gently, 3 years ago. I almost came then, but timing, Thomas finished for her. They both knew about timing. Their lives had been full of almost moments, near misses and what-ifs. The rain was beginning to ease, but neither made a move to continue their journey. The fallen branch ahead was both obstacle and excuse, keeping them suspended in this moment of recognition and revelation. That song, Margaret said suddenly, Landslide. Do you remember what I said that night at the diner? Time makes you bolder, Thomas quoted, the words coming back to him with surprising clarity. Even children get older, and I'm getting older too, she finished. They shared a look that contained decades of unspoken words. A fresh torrent of rain made visibility impossible, transforming the windshield into a waterfall. Thomas leaned forward, squinting through his glasses at what appeared to be more debris on the road ahead. That's Thompson's Creek up ahead, he said, frowning at the sound of rushing water. With this much rain, the low bridge might be flooded. We should wait it out somewhere safe. Margaret reached into her leather briefcase, removing a folded newspaper clipping that had clearly been handled many times. Thomas caught a glimpse of the headline. Chancellor Enterprises CEO steps down. Reclusive billionaire seeks personal time. You saw this, perhaps? She asked, smoothing the wrinkled paper with careful fingers. 3 months ago, Thomas nodded, Mary's sister Clara called specifically to tell me about it. She always did like to keep track of everyone's business. And what did you think when you read it? Thomas guided the truck carefully off the main road, following a familiar service track that led to higher ground. Honestly, I wondered if you'd found what you were looking for. The silence that followed felt heavy with unspoken questions. They came to rest in the shelter of an old covered bridge, one of the few remaining in Clayton County. The rain drummed on the wooden roof above them, creating an oddly intimate atmosphere in the cab of the truck. Success is a strange companion, Margaret said finally. It keeps you warm, but it doesn't keep you company. Do you know what it's like to sit in board meetings worth billions of dollars, making decisions that affect thousands of lives, and still feel completely alone? Thomas thought about long nights in his garage after Mary's passing, fixing engines that didn't need fixing, just to keep his hands busy. Loneliness comes in all price ranges, I suppose. I built something impressive, Margaret continued, her fingers tracing the edges of the newspaper clipping. Every girl who was ever told she couldn't, shouldn't, or wouldn't, I built it for them. But somewhere along the way, I forgot to build a life for myself. Lightning flashed again, illuminating the worn wooden beams above them. Thomas remembered another storm. Decades ago, when they'd sheltered in the old Anderson barn. They'd been so young, so certain that love could conquer any obstacle. You did build a life, he said gently. Just not the one we imagined that summer. No, she agreed. Not that one. She turned to face him fully. I used to drive by here, you know. Every few years, when things got too heavy in New York, I'd rent a car, drive out to Clayton County, park across from your shop. I saw you once, about 15 years ago. You were showing a young woman how to change a tire. My daughter, Sarah, Thomas said, surprised by this revelation. She was heading off to college that fall. She has your kindness, Margaret observed. I could see it in the way you taught her, patient, thorough. The same way you used to help me with my father's car, pretending it needed more repairs than it did just so we could spend time together. The rain was beginning to ease again, but neither made a move to continue their journey. The newspaper clipping sat between them like a bridge between their worlds. Why didn't you come in? Thomas asked. Any of those times. Margaret's laugh held a touch of self-deprecation. What would I have said? Hello, sorry for disappearing for decades while I built a corporate empire, but how about that rain check on coffee? Some doors are harder to open the longer you wait. And yet here you are, orchestrating a chance meeting in the rain. Maybe I finally realized that some doors need to be opened, no matter how much time has passed. She touched the brass key at her neck again. Some promises need to be kept, even if they're decades late. The old Rainbow Diner building stood like a ghost on the outskirts of town, its faded sign still visible through years of neglect. Thomas hadn't planned to stop here, but a fallen power line across the main road had forced them to take the old back route. And now here they were, facing the skeleton of their past. It's still standing, Margaret murmured, her eyes fixed on the abandoned building. I would have thought they'd torn it down by now. Thomas pulled into the gravel lot, the truck's headlights illuminating the boarded-up windows. David, my son, he bought the property a few years back, keeps talking about renovating it, but something always comes up. Through the rain-streaked windshield, a torn menu was still visible in the display case by the door, its yellow pages brittle with age. Margaret was already reaching for her door handle. We shouldn't, Thomas started, but she was already out. In the rain, moving with surprising purpose toward the display case. He grabbed his umbrella and followed. The menu was dated June 1975, preserved behind cracked plastic. Look, Margaret said, her finger tracing the glass. Apple pie à la mode, 75 cents. We used to split a slice because we couldn't each afford our own. And you always ate more than your half, Thomas added, holding the umbrella over them both. The proximity was dizzying, her perfume mixing with the scent of rain and memories. Margaret laughed, the sound echoing against the empty building. Well, you were too busy talking about that motorcycle you were going to buy. The one that would take us across the country. The Indian Scout, Thomas remembered. "I had the brochure memorized." He paused, a half-smile forming. "Ended up buying a station wagon instead. More practical for a family man." They stood there in silence, the rain creating a curtain around them. Through the boards, they could almost see their younger selves in their usual booth. Margaret with her college applications spread out, Thomas sketching engine designs on napkins. "I still have one, you know," Margaret said softly. "An Indian. Scout. Bought it the day I made my first million. It sits in my garage in Manhattan, perfectly maintained, never ridden." "Some dreams we keep in mint condition," Thomas observed, "never letting them get worn by reality." Margaret turned to him then, her grey hair damp despite the umbrella. "I found the note," she said, "the one you left at my father's house that August. It fell behind my dresser. I didn't find it until we were packing for college." Thomas felt his heart stutter. That note had contained everything his 18-year-old self hadn't been brave enough to say out loud. A proposal, a plan, a promise. "Would it have changed anything?" he asked. "If you'd found it in time?" "Everything," she said simply. "Or nothing. Who knows at that age what we're really capable of choosing?" A flash of lightning illuminated the diner's interior through the cracks, and for a moment they could see the counter where they'd planned their future, unaware of how life would reshape those plans. "You were going to wait for me," Margaret continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "The note said you'd wait while I went to college, that we'd figure it out. But then my father told me you'd started dating Mary, and I—" "He told you what?" Thomas's hand tightened on the umbrella. "Margaret, I didn't meet Mary until 2 years later, after we'd lost touch completely." She stared at him, realization dawning in her eyes. "He said he showed me a picture in the local paper. You at the Harvest Festival with a girl. A cousin's wedding," Thomas said quietly. "The photo was from my cousin's wedding. I was escorting the bride's sister down the aisle. The rain seemed to fall harder, as if trying to wash away 47 years of misunderstanding." Margaret's hand found the brass key at her neck again, gripping it tightly. "All these years," she breathed. "All these years I thought you'd moved on so quickly, that I'd meant so little." "You never wrote," Thomas said. "Not one letter. I thought you'd found everything you were looking for at college, that coming back to Clayton County was never really in your plans." The absurdity of it all, the decades of assumptions, the orchestrated meetings, the rain-soaked revelations, suddenly struck them both, and they began to laugh, the sound mixing with the storm's fury. Their laughter faded into the sound of rain, leaving them in a silence heavy with decades of missed connections. Margaret's hand moved to her wrist, where a charm bracelet, hidden until now beneath her sleeve, caught the dim light. "You kept it," Thomas said, recognizing the delicate silver chain he'd given her for her 18th birthday. Each charm had meant something, a tiny book for her dreams of college, a wrench for the hours they'd spent in his father's garage, a heart that he'd saved 3 weeks' pay to afford. "Of course I kept it." Margaret's voice was thick with emotion. "I wore it to every major business deal, every board meeting. My good luck charm, my executive team called it. They never knew—" She touched the heart charm gently. "They never knew it was my anchor to who I used to be." Thomas found himself reaching out, his weathered finger brushing the silver wrench charm. "I remember hunting all over the state for this one. Had to special order it from a jeweler in Cincinnati." "You always did pay attention to the details." Margaret's eyes met his, and suddenly they weren't standing outside an abandoned diner anymore. They were 18 again, full of dreams and certainty. "That's what made it so hard to believe you'd moved on so quickly. You weren't the type to give up easily on anything. I never did move on, not really." Thomas let his hand fall away from the bracelet. "Mary knew it, right from the start. We had a wonderful life, a beautiful love, but she always said there was a room in my heart I kept locked. She understood. That's the kind of woman she was." Margaret unclasped the bracelet, holding it in her palm. "I almost sold it once, right after I saw that newspaper photo. I was so angry, so hurt. I stormed into Tiffany's, ready to trade it for the most expensive thing they had, just to prove I could. She smiled sadly. Instead, I bought another charm. She pointed to a tiny silver key that Thomas hadn't noticed before, to remind myself that some doors shouldn't be locked forever. The rain was beginning to ease, but neither of them moved. The truth of their past hung between them like morning mist, waiting to either burn away in the sun or settle into something new. Why now, Margaret? Really? Thomas's voice was gentle but insistent. After all these years, all your success, why come back to Clayton County now? She took a deep breath, and for the first time, Thomas saw uncertainty in her eyes. Because I finally sold the company, all of it. The towers, the contracts, the endless meetings and mergers. I spent 47 years building something impressive, but last month I looked around my corner office and realized I couldn't remember the last time I'd felt truly alive. Her fingers traced the outline of the heart charm. The day I signed. The final papers, I found myself driving out here without even planning to, just like I used to do sometimes, but this time, I didn't want to just drive by. I wanted to know if that 18-year-old girl who dreamed of changing the world could still find her way home. And did she? Thomas asked softly. Margaret looked up at him, and in that moment every version of her seemed to exist at once. The ambitious teenager, the driven businesswoman, and this new person standing before him, somehow both familiar and strange. I think, she said carefully, she's beginning to remember the way. The charm bracelet caught the light again, and Thomas noticed something else, a tiny motorcycle charm, worn smooth by years of worried touches. You know, he said, his voice rough with emotion, I still know how to ride. Never did get that Scout, but I taught both my kids on an old Honda. Is that an offer? Thomas Mitchell. Could be. He managed a smile that trembled at the edges. Though maybe we should start with coffee first. There's a new place in town, not quite the Rainbow Diner, but they make a decent apple pie. Margaret slipped the bracelet back on her wrist, each charm catching the light like a memory coming back to life. Coffee sounds perfect, she said. We've got 47 years to talk about after all. And maybe, Thomas added softly, a few years ahead too. Back in the truck, Thomas found a bundle of yellowed envelopes tucked into the sun visor, Mary's old hiding place for important things she wanted him to find eventually. His hands trembled slightly as he recognized her handwriting. For when the time is right. She left you letters, Margaret asked softly, watching his face in the dim light. Mary was... Thomas paused, searching for the right words. She was always a few steps ahead of everyone else, knew things before we knew them ourselves. He opened the first envelope carefully, as if it might crumble to dust. She dated this one 3 days before she passed. Margaret sat quietly, respecting the sanctity of the moment as Thomas unfolded the letter. His eyes moved across the familiar handwriting, and a small sound escaped him, somewhere between a laugh and a sob. Dear old man, he read aloud, his voice rough with emotion. If you're reading this, then something's happened to bring her back into your life. You always said Highway 23 had a way of bringing people full circle. He had to stop for a moment, overcome. Margaret's hand moved, as if to touch his arm, then withdrew. Some comforts had to be earned back slowly. Don't you dare feel guilty. Thomas continued reading. Love isn't a finite resource. I learned that from you. Remember what I told you about opening your heart again? I meant it. Some stories deserve a second chapter. The rain had softened to a gentle patter, creating a rhythm that seemed to match the beating of their hearts. Through the windshield, they could see the diner's outline, a shadow of their past watching over their present. She must have been remarkable, Margaret said finally. She was. Thomas carefully folded the letter. You know what she did? The last time I mentioned seeing your name in the paper, she subscribed to every business magazine that might feature. Chancellor Enterprises said it was market research for the shop. He smiled at the memory. She kept a whole file of your achievements. I wish I could have met her, Margaret said, and meant it. Thanked her for taking care of you all these years. She would have liked you, Thomas replied. She always said life was too short for regrets, too precious for might-have-beens. Margaret reached into her briefcase again, pulling out a stack of envelopes bound with a faded ribbon. Speaking of might-have-beens, she untied the ribbon carefully. These are the letters I never sent. One for every major moment when I almost came back. Thomas stared at the stack. There must have been dozens. That many. The first time the company went public, Margaret said, touching the top envelope. The night my father passed away. The day I saw your son's wedding announcement in the paper. Every time I convinced myself it was too late, that too much time had passed. She gave a small, self-deprecating laugh. I even wrote one the day Mary's obituary appeared in the Times. Why didn't you come then? Because, she took a shaky breath, because I was afraid you'd hate me for waiting so long. That you'd look at me and see nothing but the girl who left and never looked back, and I couldn't bear the thought of you being right. Thomas reached for the stack of letters, then hesitated. May I? Margaret nodded, and he opened the first. 1. The paper was crisp despite its age, as if it had been carefully preserved. Dear Thomas, he read, today I became the youngest female CEO in the tech industry. The boardroom erupted in applause. Journalists asked for statements, and all I could think about was that summer night when we lay in the bed of your truck, counting stars and making promises. His voice trailed off as he scanned the rest of the letter. Each line was filled with the kind of raw honesty that only comes when writing words you never expect anyone to read. There's more, Margaret said quietly. So many more moments when I almost found the courage. But courage, it turns out, is harder to find than success. Thomas carefully refolded the letter, placing it back in its envelope. We all have our own ways of being cowards, he said. I could have looked for you, could have tried harder to understand why you never wrote back. Instead, I let my pride build walls just as high as yours. The rain had finally stopped, leaving behind a heavy silence broken only by the occasional drip from the diner's old gutters. Margaret pulled out a folded newspaper from her briefcase, a yellowed Clayton County Herald from 1976. The headline announced her marriage to industrialist Margaret Chancellor, complete with a photo of her in an elaborate wedding gown, smile perfectly practiced. My father's masterpiece, she said, spreading the paper carefully on the dashboard, arranged before I even finished my first semester. Robert was 30 years older, owned half the tech patents on the East Coast, and most importantly, came from the right kind of family. Thomas studied the photograph, seeing past the polished surface to the trapped young woman beneath. You look terrified, Margaret supplied with a bitter smile. I was, but by then I thought you'd moved on, and Father made it clear that the Chancellors could either buy his company or destroy it. The choice seemed simple at the time. What happened to him? Robert? Thomas asked carefully, noting her earlier mention of the ring's recent removal. Margaret's fingers traced the edge of the newspaper. Cancer last spring. We'd been amicably separated for 20 years, but kept up appearances for the sake of the business. He wasn't a bad man, Thomas. Just not the right one. She paused, gathering her thoughts. Before he passed, he told me something I'll never forget. He said, Maggie, we built an empire, but you never once looked at me the way you looked at that old photograph in your desk. Thomas felt his heart constrict. What photograph? She reached for her wallet, removing a worn photo that had clearly been handled thousands of times. It showed two teenagers at the Clayton County Fair, the boy holding up a small stuffed bear he'd won, the girl looking at him with undisguised adoration. Robert found it once, early in our marriage, Margaret continued, asked me who you were. I told him you were my first love, and he said, no, my dear, I rather think I'm your first marriage, but he's your first love. That was when we both knew our marriage would only ever be a business partnership. The photo trembled slightly in her hands. I built Chancellor Enterprises from Robert's patents and my father's connections, But every step up that corporate ladder was really just me running away. From this town, from that summer, from you. And now? Thomas asked softly. What are you running toward? That's the question, isn't it? Margaret carefully returned the photo to her wallet. I've spent 47 years becoming someone my 18-year-old self wouldn't recognize. The magazines call me ruthless, brilliant, calculating. All true, I suppose. But sitting here, in front of our old diner, I remember when my biggest ambition was to see your name on the auto shop sign. Thomas looked at her then, really looked at her. Beyond the elegant clothes and carefully maintained appearance, he could see the girl who'd once drawn car designs in the margins of her physics homework, who'd dreamed of revolutionizing the auto industry from a small-town garage. You did put my name on a sign, he said gently, just not the one we expected. Chancellor Enterprises changed the world, Margaret. That's not nothing. No, she agreed, it's not nothing. But it's not everything either. She turned to face him fully. Do you want to know the real reason I orchestrated this meeting? Why now, after all these years? Thomas nodded, not trusting himself to speak. Because last month, when I signed over the company, Robert's lawyer handed me a letter. My father had left it with the firm, to be delivered only after both he and Robert were gone. Want to guess what it contained? She pulled out one final document, a confession written in her father's distinctive hand, detailing every manipulation, every lie he'd told to keep them apart. The fake newspaper clipping, the intercepted letters, the carefully constructed story of Thomas moving on. He was so proud of it, Margaret said, her voice tight with old anger. Wrote that it was his greatest achievement, ensuring his daughter's proper future. Said he knew someday I'd understand it was all for the best. The inside of the truck had grown cold, prompting Thomas to start the engine again, for heat. As the warm air slowly filled the cab, he reached into his wallet and withdrew a folded piece of paper, Mary's last letter to him, carried close to his heart these past 3 years. Would you like to know about her? He asked quietly. The woman who taught me how to love again. Margaret's eyes softened. Please. Mary wasn't anything like you. Thomas began, unfolding the letter with practiced care. She loved order, routine, could tell you where every tool in the shop belonged, even though she never turned a wrench herself. But she had this way of seeing through people's armor, right to their heart. He smoothed the creased paper, Mary's neat handwriting still clear. Despite the years of handling, she wrote this the night before she passed, said she had something important to tell me, and writing was the only way to make sure she got it all out right. My dearest Thomas, he read, his voice steady despite the emotion behind it. By the time you read this, I'll be gone. Don't argue. We both know it's coming, and I have something to say about the road ahead. You've given me 38 beautiful years, but I've always known there was a chapter of your story left unfinished. I saw it in your eyes every time. You passed that old diner, every time you heard her name in the news. Margaret's breath caught audibly, but Thomas continued reading. Love isn't betrayed by remembering, dear. I've never felt threatened by your past because you gave me such a beautiful present. But now I need you to promise me something. When the time comes, and it will come, don't hide behind loyalty to a ghost. I've had a wonderful life being loved by you. Now, I want you to have a wonderful life loving again. The letter trembled slightly in his hands. P.S. Check the back of the dresser when you're ready. I left something there you might need someday. Did you? Margaret asked softly. Check behind the dresser. Thomas nodded, reaching into his coat pocket. Found it last week. Seemed like Mary knew something I didn't. She always did. He pulled out a small, weathered business card. On the back, in Mary's handwriting, was a phone number and the words, Chancellor Enterprises, Executive Office. She knew, Margaret whispered. Somehow, she knew. Mary believed life gives us second chances, Thomas said, but only if we're brave enough to take them. He tucked the letter carefully away, She also believed that timing was everything, said sometimes hearts need time to grow into the love they're meant to find. Margaret's hand moved to the brass key at her neck again. "And what do you believe, Thomas?" "I believe," he paused, choosing his words carefully. "I believe Mary was right about most things. And I believe that sometimes life gives us a chance to write a new ending to an old story." The warmth from the heater had finally reached them, pushing back the chill of the rain and years of silence. Outside, the clouds were beginning to break, revealing patches of stars above the old diner. "You know," Margaret said, her voice thoughtful, "when I was building Chancellor Enterprises, I used to imagine what you'd think of each decision. Would Thomas approve of this merger? Would he understand this acquisition? It was like having a conscience in the boardroom, this memory of a boy who believed in honest work and straight dealing." "And did I approve?" Thomas asked, a small smile playing at his lips. "Not always," she admitted, "but those were usually the decisions I came to regret." She turned to face him fully. "I spent decades building something impressive, Thomas, but sitting here, I'm wondering if maybe it's time to build something meaningful instead." The stars were fully visible now, the storm clouds having moved on to trouble other parts of the county. Margaret pulled out her business card, sleek, minimalist, with just her name and Chancellor Enterprises, CEO Emeritus, embossed in silver. "Last week this card opened doors in every major city in the world," she said, turning it over in her hands. "Now it's just a reminder of a life I'm leaving behind." She placed it on the dashboard next to Mary's old card. "Funny how different two pieces of paper can be." "Different stories," Thomas observed. "Different dreams." "I've been thinking about dreams lately," Margaret said. "Did you know David's idea for renovating the diner?" "I do. I've seen the plans." Thomas turned to her, surprised. "How did you—" "I make it my business to know things, Thomas. It's a habit I'm finding hard to break." She smiled softly. "He's been trying to get a small business loan for 2 years. Banks see a small-town restoration project as too risky." "He hasn't mentioned that to me," Thomas said, frowning. "Though that explains why he keeps putting it off." "The thing is," Margaret continued, her voice careful, "I happen to have some experience with business investments, and I find myself with quite a bit of capital looking for the right project." Thomas stiffened slightly. "Margaret, let me finish," she said gently. "I'm not offering charity. I'm talking about investment in a community that should have been mine too. The diner, the auto shop, maybe even that technical training program David's been dreaming about for local kids." She reached into her briefcase one last time, pulling out a thick folder. "These are his plans, excellent ones actually. A modern garage with classic car restoration, a diner that honors the history while meeting today's standards, apprenticeships for young mechanics. He has vision, your son." Thomas took the folder, thumbing through pages he'd never seen. "How long have you been planning this?" "Planning? Since the day I decided to sell the company. But dreaming about it," she touched the brass key at her neck, "maybe for 47 years. The implications hung in the air between them. This wasn't just about business investment. It was about roots, community, belonging, about coming home." "The town's changed," Thomas said slowly. "It's not the same place you left." "I've changed too," Margaret replied. "I'm not the same girl who left." She paused, choosing her next words carefully. "But maybe that's the point. Maybe we've all changed enough to make something new out of something old." Thomas looked at the 2 business cards on the dashboard, Mary's handwritten note and Margaret's corporate emboss catching the starlight differently. Past and present, memory and possibility. "And what about us?" he asked finally. "Where do we fit in this vision of yours?" Margaret's hand moved to her charm bracelet, touching each piece as if gathering courage from the memories they held. "That depends," she said softly, "on whether you believe in second chances, on whether 2 people who've lived whole lives apart can find their way back to each other, on whether—" "Margaret," Thomas interrupted gently, "you're starting to sound like a business proposal." She laughed then, a sound free from the polish of boardrooms and society galas. "Old habits," she admitted. "I spent so many years calculating risks and returns that I almost forgot how to just feel." "And what do you feel?" Thomas asked, his voice low and serious. The night pressed close around them, the old diner standing witness to another moment of truth between them. Margaret turned in her seat, her carefully maintained composure slipping just enough to reveal the girl who'd once dreamed beneath these same stars. "I feel," she said slowly, "like I'm finally exactly where I'm supposed to be. And I'm terrified of making another mistake, of running away again, of being 18 and scared." Thomas finished for her. "Yes," she whispered. "Only this time I'm terrified of not taking the chance." From somewhere in her briefcase, Margaret produced a well-worn yearbook, its blue cover faded with age. "Found this when I was cleaning out my Manhattan office," she said, opening it to a marked page. "Clayton County High, class of '75. There. They were, preserved in black and white, Thomas Mitchell and Margaret Porter, their senior photos separated by just a few pages of alphabetical fate. Under his picture was a list of activities: Auto Club President, football, honor roll, and a quote, "The future belongs to those who believe in the beauty of their dreams." "Eleanor Roosevelt," Thomas murmured. "You chose that quote for me, because you believed in everyone's dreams, not just your own." Margaret's finger traced the edge of his photograph. "Look at us, so young, so certain we had it all figured out." Thomas's photo showed a confident young man with clear eyes and an easy smile. Beside it, Margaret's portrait captured a girl with determined eyes and carefully styled hair, her quote reading, "Success is not final, failure is not fatal, it is the courage to continue that counts." "Churchill," Thomas said, "though I notice you left off the part about whiskey." Margaret laughed. "Father would have been scandalized. He already thought I was too outspoken for a Porter daughter." She turned another page, revealing the candid photos section. There they were again, caught in an unguarded moment by the school photographer. Thomas leaning against his father's tow truck, showing Margaret something under the hood, both of them laughing, completely absorbed in each other. "I remember that. A day," Thomas said softly. "You were wearing that blue dress your mother hated, the one with grease stains that never quite came out. She burned it," Margaret revealed, "after I left for college. Said no daughter of hers would keep such common reminders." She touched the photograph gently. "She didn't know I had this." The yearbook held other memories. The senior carnival, where Thomas had won her that stuffed bear, the Honor Society induction, where they'd both given speeches, the auto shop showcase, where Margaret had surprised everyone by presenting a detailed proposal for modernizing classic car engines. "You know what I remember most about that showcase?" Thomas asked. "Not the projects or the awards. I remember watching you light up when you talked about fuel injection systems. You made mechanical engineering sound like poetry. And you made me believe I could change the world." Margaret turned to the last page she'd marked. It was the predictions section, most likely to succeed, with her photo prominently displayed. Beside it, in flowing script, was the class's prophecy: "Margaret Porter will revolutionize the business world, but never forget her small-town roots." "Half right," she said quietly. "I did revolutionize things, just forgot the other part along the way." "Until now," Thomas added. Margaret closed the yearbook carefully. "Until now," she agreed. "Though I'm not sure Clayton County is ready for the prodigal daughter's return, especially one with my reputation." "You'd be surprised," Thomas said. "This town's grown up too. David's training program has a waiting list of kids who dream bigger than their circumstances. Sarah, my daughter, she teaches engineering at the high school now. Started a robotics club that's competing nationally. Like father, like children," Margaret observed. "They inherited your gift for nurturing dreams. They had good examples. Mary was a born teacher, even if her classroom was our kitchen table." He paused, remembering. She would have loved Sarah's robotics club. "Always said education was how we built bridges to the future," Wise woman, Margaret said softly. I'd like to hear more about her if you're willing to share, and about Sarah and David, about the life you built, the memories you made. I have 47 years of stories to catch up on. The yearbook sat between them, a bridge between who they were and who they'd become. Outside, the night had deepened, but neither made a move to leave their shelter of memory and possibility. Thomas reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a small wooden box, worn smooth by years of handling. Inside, his wedding ring caught the dim light, gold band still bright despite the years. I took it off last month, he said quietly. First, at times since, he didn't need to finish the sentence. It felt like betrayal at first, still does sometimes. Margaret watched as he ran his thumb over the ring's smooth surface. And other times I hear Mary's voice so clearly. It's like she's sitting right here with us. Life's for the living, old man, she'd say. Don't you dare use me as an excuse to hide from it. The ring caught another gleam of light as he turned it, revealing an inscription inside. Love multiplies. Her favorite saying, Thomas explained. She had it engraved as a surprise for our 10th anniversary. Said it was to remind me that love isn't a finite resource. She sounds like she had life figured out better than most of us, Margaret said softly. She did. Thomas carefully placed the ring back in its box. You know what she told Sarah once? Your father's heart is like that garage of his, always room for one more project, one more person who needs help. She understood things about me that I didn't understand myself. The box made a soft sound as he closed it, like a chapter ending gently. Last week I found myself telling one of her stories to a customer at the shop. Laughed in all the right places, felt the warmth of the memory instead of the pain. That's when I knew I was ready to take off the ring. Margaret's hand moved to her own ring finger, where the pale band of skin was still visible. Robert and I removed our rings years ago, but we kept up appearances. Image was everything in our world. The day after his funeral, I sold every piece of jewelry he'd ever given me. Donated it all to a women's shelter in the Bronx. She reached out slowly, her fingers hovering over the wooden box without touching it. But this is different. This ring held real love. Yes, Thomas agreed simply. It did. I'm not trying to replace her, Margaret said suddenly, the words bursting out as if she'd been holding them back all evening. I couldn't, even if I wanted to. She gave you a beautiful life, raised your children, stood by you through everything. I'm just hoping there might be room in that garage heart of yours for someone who finally found her way back home. Thomas was quiet for a long moment, studying the wooden box. You know what the hardest part of taking off this ring was? He asked finally. Not the memories or the guilt or even the fear of moving forward. It was realizing that keeping it on had become another way of hiding from life, from possibilities, from chances. Margaret finished softly. Mary knew that would happen. That's why she made me promise. He touched the box one last time before slipping it back into his pocket. She knew someday I'd need permission to be more than just her widower. And now? Margaret's voice was barely above a whisper. Now I think maybe it's time to stop hiding. From life, from possibilities. He turned to face her fully. From the girl who used to dream about changing the world from a small-town garage. The moment stretched between them, heavy with potential and the weight of their shared history. Outside, the first hints of dawn were beginning to lighten the eastern sky, turning the old diner's windows into mirrors that reflected back their older, wiser selves. I'm not that girl anymore, Margaret said quietly. No, Thomas agreed. You're more. You're the woman who did change the world, and now maybe you're the one who's ready to change it again, just differently this time. Dawn was breaking over Clayton County when Margaret pulled out a property deed from her briefcase. The official seal of the county recorder's office gleamed in the early light. I bought the Miller estate, she said without preamble. All 120 acres of it, including the old manufacturing plant. Thomas stared at her, understanding slowly dawning. The Miller property bordered both the auto shop and the diner, its abandoned factory a reminder of the town's more prosperous past. When? He managed to ask. 3 months ago, through a holding company. No one knew it was me. She spread the deed on the dashboard. The factory's got good bones. With the right renovation, it could house that technical training program David's been planning. The field's behind it, perfect for a test track, and there's plenty of room for expansion. Margaret, Thomas said carefully, that's millions in development costs. She smiled, the same confident smile he remembered from their youth, when no problem seemed unsolvable. Thomas, I just sold a tech empire for billions. Money isn't the issue. What I need is someone who knows cars, who knows this community, who can help turn this into something real instead of just another corporate project. You're talking about David's dream, he said slowly. The classics restoration program, the apprenticeships. I'm talking about our dream, she corrected gently. The one we had before life took us in different directions. Remember those nights we spent planning? You were going to teach mechanics. I was going to handle the business. Inside, we were going to build something that mattered. Thomas picked up the deed, reading the fine print. Chancellor Technical Institute. He read from the proposed development plan attached. That part's negotiable, Margaret said quickly. It's just a placeholder. Though I thought maybe Mitchell Chancellor Technical Institute had a nice ring. And to it. The sun was rising properly now, painting the old diner in shades of gold and promise. Through its weathered windows, Thomas could almost see their younger selves, heads bent over notebooks, planning a future they'd never got to share. This is why you came back, he said. It wasn't a question. Part of it, she admitted. The bigger part is sitting right next to me. But yes, I want to build something here, something that honors both who we were and who we've become. Your practical wisdom and my business experience, David's vision and Sarah's teaching skills, a place where kids like we used to be can learn to build their own dreams. She touched the deed lightly. I spent decades building things that made money. Now I want to build something that makes a difference. Thomas looked out at the Miller property, visible in the distance. Where others saw abandoned buildings and overgrown fields, he could suddenly see Margaret's vision, a state-of-the-art facility rising from the ruins, classic cars being restored alongside cutting-edge electric vehicles, young people learning trades that could change their lives. David's going to think we're crazy, he said finally, a smile tugging at his lips. Probably, Margaret agreed, Sarah too, but they're young enough to appreciate a little crazy and experienced enough to help make it work. And us? Thomas asked, turning back to her. Where do we fit in this grand plan? Margaret's hand found his, the first real contact they'd shared in 47 years. Her fingers were cooler than he remembered, but they still fit perfectly against his palm. We fit, she said simply, wherever we choose to. No pressure, no expectations, just two people who've lived enough to know what matters, building something worthwhile together. In the growing light of dawn, Margaret withdrew 2 train tickets from her briefcase. The California Limited, she said, laying them on the dashboard. Leaves from Chicago next week. 47 hours through some of the most beautiful country in America. Thomas picked up one of the tickets, noting the destination, San Francisco. That's quite a journey. I thought we could do what we never got to do, she said softly. Take that cross-country trip we planned the summer after graduation. Different route than we originally imagined, but she touched her charm bracelet, the tiny motorcycle charm catching the light. Sometimes the scenic route is better anyway. And after San Francisco, that's the beautiful part, Margaret said. We decide then. The Institute will take at least a year to get up and running. David and Sarah can handle the initial development. They've earned the right to shape their own vision. Meanwhile, we can take the time to what? Thomas asked when she hesitated. To learn each other again, she finished. To figure out if what we feel is real or just the ghost of who we used to be. No pressure, no expectations, just two people who've earned the right to take their time. The tickets lay between them like a bridge between past and present. Thomas thought about Mary's letter in his pocket, about her insistence that life was meant to be lived fully. He thought about David and Sarah, about how they'd react to this unexpected twist in their family story. "You know," he said carefully, "I've never been on a train for more than an hour. Always drove everywhere. Seems fitting that my first real journey would be with you." Margaret's breath caught slightly. "Is that a yes?" "It's a maybe," he replied, but his smile was warm. "I need to talk to the kids first. They deserve to hear this from me, in person. And you need to meet them properly, not just as the woman from the business world, but as the girl their father used to love," Margaret supplied gently. "As the woman who might be part of their future," Thomas corrected. "They're adults with their own lives, their own dreams. This institute of yours, it's going to change things for them too." Margaret nodded, understanding in her eyes. "Of course. Family comes first, always. But," Thomas continued, reaching for her hand again, "if they're okay with all this, I think maybe it's time I saw what the world looks like from a train window, with someone who never lost her sense of adventure." The sun was fully up now, transforming the old diner's windows into sheets of gold. They could see their reflections clearly. Two people who had lived full lives apart, now contemplating the possibility of building something new together. "You know what Mary would say about all this?" Thomas asked, his voice rough with emotion. Margaret squeezed his hand gently. "What?" "About time, old man, about time." The tickets seemed to glow in the morning light, promising not just a journey across the country, but a journey back to themselves, or perhaps forward to who they might still become. The sun had fully risen when Thomas pulled his truck into the driveway of a modest two-story house on Maple Street. Margaret sat straighter in her seat, taking in the well-tended garden and the auto parts calendar hanging in the garage window. "You're home?" she asked softly. "For 40 years. Thomas nodded, killing the engine. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a key. Newly cut, the metal still bright and unmarked. "Made this yesterday. Somehow I knew it was time." "Time for what?" "Time to sell," he said simply. "Sarah's been offering to help me find a smaller place for years. Said this house deserves a young family, kids running up and down the stairs like she and David used to do." Margaret studied the house, imagining the life that had unfolded within its walls. "It's beautiful, Thomas. All those memories are right here," he touched his heart, "where they belong. Mary and I raised our family here, but she always said houses were meant to hold future stories, not just past ones." He held out the key. "The realtor's coming next week. Would you like to see it? Before everything changes?" Margaret took the key carefully, its weight somehow more significant than the thousands of corporate keys she'd held over the years. "Are you sure?" Instead of answering, Thomas got out and walked around to open her door, a gesture from their youth that made her smile despite the gravity of the moment. The house smelled of coffee and wood polish, with hints of the motor oil that seemed to follow all mechanics home. Photos lined the walls. David and Sarah growing up, family celebrations, moments frozen in time. And there, integrated naturally among them, was a small framed picture of two teenagers at a county fair. "Mary put that up," Thomas said, following. Her gaze said every love story deserves to be remembered. They moved through the house slowly, Thomas sharing stories of each room. The kitchen, where Mary had taught Sarah to bake. The living room where David had announced his engagement. The garage-turned-workshop where Thomas had spent countless hours teaching his children the mysteries of engines and resilience. In the master bedroom, Margaret paused. A woman's touch was still evident in the curtains, the quilted bedspread, the arrangement of family photos on the dresser. But there were signs of change too. Empty spaces where personal items had been carefully packed away, closets half cleared, a life being gently dismantled. "It's not about forgetting," Thomas said quietly, reading her expression. "It's about making room for what comes next." Margaret touched the dresser, the same one that had hidden his long-ago note. "And what does come next, Thomas?" He stepped closer, taking her hand. I don't know exactly, but I do know I'm ready to find out. The kids are coming for dinner tonight. We can tell them everything about us, about the Institute, about whatever this is becoming. And if they don't approve, they're Mary's children too. Thomas smiled. They believe in love multiplying, not dividing, but they'll have questions, concerns. They deserve honest answers. Margaret squeezed his hand. Then we'll give them honest answers about the past, about our plans for the Institute, about us. They stood there in the morning light, surrounded by the echoes of one love story, while perhaps beginning another. Through the window they could see the Miller property in the distance, its abandoned buildings waiting for new purpose. You know, Margaret said thoughtfully, there's a nice Victorian house on the Institute grounds. The Miller family's old home. It needs work, but it has a great garage and plenty of room for grandchildren to visit. 6 months later, the Clayton County Fair was in full swing. Thomas stood by the same game booth where he'd won a stuffed bear nearly half a century ago, watching as David explained the mechanics of classic car engines to a group of enthusiastic teenagers. Behind them, the Institute's booth drew steady crowds, its banner proudly displaying Mitchell Chancellor Technical Institute, building tomorrow's dreams today. A familiar hand slipped into his, and he turned to find Margaret beside him. Her silver hair catching the late afternoon sun. She traded her corporate suits for casual elegance, though the brass key still hung around her neck. Sarah's presentation on electric vehicle conversion is drawing quite a crowd, she said, nodding toward the exhibition hall. 3 local businesses have already offered apprenticeships. Just like you predicted, Thomas smiled. The town was ready for change. They walked together through the fairgrounds, past the Ferris wheel where they'd shared their first kiss, past the picnic area where they'd planned their future. A photographer from the local paper stopped them, asking for a picture of the Institute's founders. For symmetry, he said, positioning them in front of the same backdrop where their senior photos had been taken. We're doing a then and now piece about the fair's history. As the camera clicked, Margaret leaned closer to Thomas. Think we should tell him we have the original? She whispered, referring to the old photograph they'd found in his wallet. That rainy night. Let him discover it, Thomas replied. Some stories are better when they unfold naturally. The train journey had been everything they'd hoped for and more. 47 hours of watching America roll by, sharing stories of the years they'd missed, learning each other again. By the time they reached San Francisco, they'd known. What they felt wasn't just nostalgia, it was something new, something that honored their past while embracing their future. David and Sarah had taken the news of their relationship and the Institute better than either had dared hope. Mom always said you had more love to give, Sarah had said over dinner that first night. She made us promise to support you when you found it. Now, as they walked the fairgrounds, they passed familiar faces and new ones. Clayton County was growing again, the Institute bringing fresh energy to the community. The old diner was under renovation, its classic style preserved while being updated for a new generation. Hard to believe it's only been 6 months, Margaret mused, touching her charm bracelet. A new charm had joined the others, a tiny train, added somewhere between Chicago and San Francisco. Having second thoughts, Thomas asked, only half joking, only about waiting 47 years to come home. She stopped walking, turning to face him. The Board of Education called this morning. They want to expand the Institute's program to 3 more counties. That's wonderful news. It is, she agreed, but it means more work, more decisions. She hesitated. Are you sure this is what you want? Trading your quiet retirement for all this? Thomas looked around the fairgrounds, at the mix of old and new, at the energy and possibility in the air. You know what Mary used to say about retirement? It's not about stopping. It's about starting something new. He pulled her closer, not caring who saw. At 73, he'd earned the right to show affection openly. Besides, someone once told me that the best moments come from being exactly where you need to be. A new photo joined the old one in his wallet that evening. Thomas and Margaret. At the fair, 47 years apart, but somehow right on time. The sunset painted Clayton County in shades of gold, as Thomas and Margaret sat on the porch of the renovated Victorian house overlooking the Institute grounds. In Margaret's hands was a small silver locket, a gift from Sarah and David containing 4 perfectly sized photographs. Their younger selves at the fair, Mary's gentle smile, and their recent fair photo, all arranged in a delicate circle, like chapters in a book, Margaret said softly, running her finger over the smooth, silver surface. All part of the same story. The Institute's lights were still on, the evening class in advanced restoration techniques running late. Through the workshop windows, they could see David demonstrating techniques to a mixed group of students, some straight from high school, others retraining after years in other careers, each one carrying their own dreams of building something meaningful. Mary would have loved this, Thomas said, his voice warm with certainty. All of it. The Institute, the students, seeing David and Sarah so fulfilled. He paused, taking Margaret's, and seeing us finally find our way back to each other. The evening air carried the scent of autumn, reminding them of that rainy night 6 months ago when a chance encounter on Highway 23 had changed everything. The old diner was set to reopen next month, its classic charm preserved but updated, with a modern teaching kitchen where culinary students could train alongside the mechanics. "It's strange," Margaret mused, closing the locket gently. "I spent decades thinking success meant building something impressive. Now I realize it's about building something that matters." She smiled at the sight of Sarah's car pulling into the drive right on time for their weekly family dinner. "Something that lasts beyond us." Thomas watched as their blended family gathered. David's wife Emma carrying their newest grandchild, Sarah and her husband Mark bringing their famous apple pie, everyone converging with the easy warmth of well-practiced routine. This was what Mary had meant about love multiplying, about hearts having room for new stories while honoring the old ones. "You know what this reminds me of?" Margaret asked as they stood to greet their family. "That last night at the Rainbow Diner, when we were planning our future. We got so much wrong about how life would unfold, but somehow," she touched the brass key that still hung around her neck, "somehow we ended up exactly where we were meant to be. Just took a few detours along the way." The porch light illuminated their small gathering, casting warm light on faces young and old, each carrying a piece of their shared story forward. The locket caught the light as Margaret moved, its 4 photos telling a tale of love, lost and found, of dreams deferred but never abandoned, of the mysterious ways life sometimes offers second chances to those patient enough to recognize them. "To detours," Thomas said softly, raising his coffee mug in a quiet toast. "To detours," Margaret agreed, "and to finally finding our way home." Behind them, the Institute stood as testament to what could be built from the foundations of an old dream and the wisdom of lived experience. Before them stretched the promise of tomorrow, rich with possibility, and in that moment, surrounded by family and wrapped in the warmth of hard-won love, they were exactly where they needed to be.